The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. With me tonight are Catherine Reed and Saba Nagatu. These are two young ladies that I encountered when they gave presentations regarding civil rights at the Roots Camp, Louisiana at Southern University recently here in Baton Rouge. Southern University Law Center, to be specific. And you ladies are doing this mainly, it was geared toward activists, right?
Correct.
Okay, but I want to, the things that you shared with the audience at your presentation were very interesting to me, and I'd like to get on those too. But first, I'd like to introduce Catherine Reed. She's a second-year law student at Southern University Law Center. She's a junior editor of the Law Center's Law Review, the vice chair of the Southern University Law Center Moot Court, and the teaching assistant of Vice Chancellor White. Catherine has been active in grassroots campaigning for several political campaigns, acting as a field director and special events director. She recently competed in the William E. McGee National Civil Rights Moot Court competition in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she had to articulate why the right to freedom from physical constraint is a fundamental right. And Saba Nagatu was a young lady born and raised in Baton Rouge, first-generation Ethiopian American, and I think that's awesome. Attended LSU and received a bachelor degree in political science. Second bachelor degree in history, also at LSU, and is currently enrolled in the Southern University Law Center, pursuing a Juris Doctorate. Okay, good, I got that. And she's interested in the area of law, civil rights, international human rights law, immigration law, and foreign policy. Good evening, ladies.
Good evening.
Please tell us briefly what moot court is. Moot courts.
Moot court is a way for law students to practice as appellate advocates. It's a way to get practical experience in the field of appellate advocacy. So you are essentially arguing in front of a panel of judges, which is supposed to imitate a Supreme Court type of argument. You're given an issue about some maybe constitutional law question, or it just depends on what type of competition you're going to, and you have to argue as either the petitioner or the respondent. And with our particular case that we did in Minnesota, it was about the freedom from physical constraint. We had to argue on the respondent side for the state and also the petitioner side. So we had to kind of double dip and see both sides of the argument. It's a great way for students to understand two sides of an argument, and it's a great way for you to get practice ready after you graduate.
Okay, good. And your presentation at Southern dealt with, well, first off, you led off talking about restorative justice. Mm-hmm. And I, as an old white guy, don't know what that means. Can you help explain that? And I'm sure there are a lot of other people out there who don't either.
For sure. Restorative justice is an approach that seeks to repair the harm done by criminal behavior to the individual or the community that was involved.
Criminal behavior by the government, I presume.
It depends. So what we're seeking to do is find an alternative way to restore wrongs that have happened to people, either done by the government or some criminal activity that the person has done, finding alternative ways to prison reform or finding alternative ways for the government to acknowledge what they have done to people.
Okay. It's more of, I think what I got from it when I was there was it's intended to find other ways other than punishment to get positive results.
To essentially make right as much as possible, right? So whatever the harm may be, whether it was the government or another individual, whatever that offensive behavior was, it's a theory that tries to approach from an angle of
rehabilitation rather than punishment.
Right. Okay, good, cool. Okay. And you focused on a period of civil rights activism, and particularly a young man named John Garner, and the protest involved here in Baton Rouge, right? Would you tell us about that?
So ultimately, Mr. Garner was a 26-year-old law student at Southern University, and he participated in the string of lunch counter sit-in protests during the Civil Rights era in 1960 right here in Baton Rouge. These were staged sit-ins initially that began with 4 students from Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, and in an effort to combat the state's discriminatory policy of segregated public accommodations. So when the Greensboro protests garnered enough national media attention, it kind of catapulted this peaceful demonstration to spread throughout the South. By the end of March 1960, the movement spread to 55 cities and 13 states, including several HBCUs, one of them being Southern University. Mr. Garner and 15 other students participated in the movement with the same purpose of opposing Louisiana's segregated policies and laws that were taking place here. So in an effort to deter these protests, the Louisiana's Board of Education directed the presidents of all the state institutions here to take disciplinary actions against any student who participated in the demonstrations. However, this worked against them because it actually motivated the students even more to want to participate.
Now, you said this was Southern University's administration that put that threat on them?
Well, it was the orders were given by the Louisiana State Board of Education to all of the presidents at the state universities.
Of all state universities?
Of all state universities.
Oh, okay.
So they were trying to kind of deter that wave of demonstrations that was kind of taking place in Mississippi and Alabama.
Right.
So to prevent that from happening, they kind of they gave directives to Southern University and the rest of the universities of the state to make sure they took stern disciplinary action against any students that were involved in the demonstrations.
So essentially the policy said if you partook in any criminal activity, you would be indefinitely suspended. So participating in these protests was against statutory law of Louisiana. Essentially, you're being criminalized for participating.
Yes. And you're talking about the sit-ins and now at the lunch counters, right? I've often wondered, in fact, it occurred to me this morning, if such protests are simply intended to expose the unspoken of absurdities to the light of day. I mean, I think everybody, even white people, could see the absurdity of not allowing black people to sit at lunch counters, but they never talked about it. It's just one of those things. And oh no, we have these troublemakers now forcing us to come out and acknowledge it.
Absolutely. I mean, the very fact that African Americans at this time, which is the 1960s, they were able to shop in these stores. So it was okay for them to spend their money. However, they didn't have, they weren't given or acknowledged with enough respect or equality to have a meal at the counter. So they could buy from the stores, but they couldn't sit at the lunch counter to enjoy a meal.
And the funny thing about it, with this particular protest at Sitman's drugstore, none of the employees or any of the patrons in the store notified the police that the students were in there and they were causing disruption. It was a police officer who was walking by who called in reinforcements to escort the students out of the store.
Okay, let's get back to where we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, I think. Can we mention that Mr. Garner was a law student at Southern University at this time, and they've been told that they can't participate in protests. Mm-hmm. But you stated in your notes here that Mr. Garner and 15 other students from Southern were able to successfully strategize with community leaders and organizers on carefully executing several lunch counter sit-ins in downtown Baton Rouge.
Correct.
And I found that carefully executed statement very interesting. Why would careful execution be necessary? Why would it be important?
Well, in order for them to be able to combat the charges, because they knew that they would be arrested. So therefore, the purpose was to make sure that once they did go into litigation, they would be able to argue their charges of peacefully protesting as opposed to disturbing the peace.
Okay, I thought maybe it was mainly to make sure that they were charged with sitting at a counter that black people aren't supposed to sit at. And they want to avoid giving them a legitimate reason to arrest them. Is that part of it too?
Well, they did get help from A.P. Toro, Johnny Jones, Thurgood Marshall, and
Yes.
Mr. Greensburg. And they were instrumental in helping them understand that you need to go into this lunch counter and you need to just be calm. You need to be quiet. You need to sit there, because the statute particularly says if you are disturbing the peace, that is what you're going to be charged with. And they knew that no matter what, them just sitting at the counter would be considered, I don't even know how to explain it.
Okay, so wait a minute now. Was there any law at all that said black people can't sit at the counters?
No, it was just a custom. It was a state policy. So it wasn't written, but it was understood.
I see.
And in Louisiana, customs are as effectual as law.
Right, but now I'm getting a clearer picture with it. So as I understand, the protesters went in first and made purchases in the stores,
Correct.
which was necessary to legitimize their presence in the store.
Right. To basically, so when they did litigate, they could argue that they were patrons. Their
Right.
actions showed that they were patrons. That they
Right.
weren't. It didn't come from someone who wanted to ensue some type of disruption.
Right. All
Right.
that just to make sure that they keep a close boundary on what they could be charged with. And
Right.
okay, and so what happened?
Because your acts are essentially what allowed the charges to be pursued.
Right, exactly.
So if you're able to argue that you weren't, if there's no evidence to support the charges, then therefore they didn't have any grounds to convict them.
Right. They can't count on custom to when they're applying the law.
No, exactly.
At least not when they go outside the state, which is in fact what happened here. So, okay, so they were all the protesters were arrested in this case for disturbing the peace.
Correct.
Right.
And what happened then?
Well, then they were stationed in jail for 6 days, and the community was able to work together to post bond for them. And they went to trial. The trial court upheld their convictions. They appealed. The appellate court confirmed the convictions. They went to the Louisiana Supreme Court, who affirmed the convictions. And then they went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where they ultimately overturned the convictions because there was absolutely no evidence that they were violating the statute by disturbing the peace.
In fact, somebody, I think, involved with the court made the remark that the only people who seemed to be disturbing the peace were the police officers.
Right.
Justice Frankfurter, in the oral arguments, he was very adamant about, well, it doesn't really seem like your clients actually were doing anything, and it was the police officers who were causing the disruption of everyone in the Sitman store because, like we were saying, they just went into the store, purchased their products, and were just sitting there.
And it's important to remember that no one called the police on Mr. Garner or Vernon Jordan. The manager was actually there and welcomed their business. It was actually the off-duty police officer who noticed them sitting down at a segregated lunch counter.
Was the owner white?
Yes. Yeah, it was downtown Baton Rouge. So it's also important to remember that even the location that they chose to protest in, all of the protests were conducted in downtown Baton Rouge. And downtown Baton Rouge is where you have a lot of these retail corporate stores that are there that have these segregated lunch counters for them to be able to conduct these demonstrations. So everything from the very beginning to the end was strategized.
That's awesome. And that's something I think that older Americans like me, and I don't know if black Americans, I would think that they would know all about this already because it's so important to them, but a lot of Americans, I don't think, realize how much planning and research went into all these things. I mean, all we get is a televised version of what they did, and for all we know, it's just spontaneous. But there was a lot of serious. Well, you had Thurgood Marshall and
Yes.
the other
Yes, they had counsel.
legal beagles right there talking to you ahead of time, so you knew they knew what they were doing.
Yes,
Absolutely.
they did.
Yes, so they were able to coordinate with organizers and community leaders and have counsel of attorneys to be able to methodically pursue this protest. And the protest, I think they lasted 2 days. It was March 28th and March 29th. The first protest took March 28th at a retail store, Crest Store. And then the second protest was conducted the next day. One was at Sidman's drugstore, and simultaneously the Greyhound station was conducted at the same time.
And given the history of such protests, recent history at the time, the violence associated with it, that took a lot of guts, a lot of bravery.
Absolutely.
And how would you, I mean, doesn't that figure into your advice toward people who would become activists too?
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember that these were young African American students. Not all of them were well off or even had the means to bail themselves out of jail. But even with that hurdle there, it did not stop them from wanting to participate and become involved in the demonstration. So it kind of shows you the fearlessness that they have, which you tend to see when it comes to these young coordinated movements, the power of the youth, as we say, or the power of the people, to where they kind of have that fire in them to want to challenge society's norms.
Okay, but I remember you making a remark during the presentation at Southern that for activists, when you're forming your organization and you're choosing the people to actually do the protest,
Right.
you want to make sure they're strong enough to deal with the consequences.
Right, that's
So
what I
that
was going to
takes
bring
special
up.
people, yeah.
These students had a lot at stake, especially Mr. John Gardner and the other law student who participated, because it was hard for African Americans to get professional degrees in the 60s. It was a prestigious honor, and he knew what he was potentially giving up when he participated in these protests. And like we mentioned at the grassroots campaign, not everyone who participates in these big movements are going to be written down in history and
Right.
remembered throughout all of time. So you do need to take that into account when you're considering doing activism and protest, that even though you might not be remembered, the larger movement needs your strides.
And in fact, that is something that dawned on me in listening to you during the presentation. It was like, once again, we have the high profile protests that we saw, people like me saw on TV,
Right.
but in reality, there was a whole lot more going on everywhere.
Right.
And that's where I wonder, too, with restorative justice, for John Garner's, I mean, I guess he's passed on now,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
at least his family knows that he is getting the recognition now and it is being acknowledged. But it's also, I mean, it makes me wonder, and I hope it makes other people wonder, just how many more black people we have walking amongst us, older people, that had been through the fire like that.
Many.
Yeah. Well,
Many.
there's a woman at my church who rode the buses and suffered, down into the South
Right.
to integrate the bus services, and she saw a lot. She was
Yeah.
heavily
Well,
involved.
and that
in
was
it.
actually a part of our research. We studied the Alabama case where students participated in a similar protest, and it was just to kind of get an idea of what type of restorative justice we would be seeking for Mr. Gardner. And it's just awe-gazzing to know that, like, this was all over. This was all over the South, and there's so many people who were impacted by these protests.
Yes, and the flip side of that is the impact these small efforts had. I mean, it was a cumulative thing, and
Right.
most Americans, most white Americans anyway, don't get that perspective.
Right. And I think what's also important to add is the trauma that comes with it, which is why we said that it's important to have whoever the movement leader is going to be, it's important to make sure that they're able to endure the consequences that stem from these type of movements, typically movements that involve civil and political rights. In the case of Mr. Garner, he wasn't able to pursue his law degree or his law career. And as an effect, it can be seen throughout his professional career that may have affected him. Some students were able to actually become judges and finish their education at different different universities throughout the state. However, Mr. Garner wasn't one of them. And so you can kind of imagine what that may have, how that may have impacted him.
Well, what happened to him? Whatever.
He actually ended up serving in the K-9 division at NOPD. And then I think after 8 or 9 years, he became a carpenter. So he kind of just picked up work here and there wherever he could.
Wow. Did you come across anything about how he felt about his sacrifices?
I think that he was disappointed from the president of Southern University, Dr. Clark at the time. He felt that what happened to him in terms of being charged and convicted for protesting, he expected that. I think what he didn't expect was for the president to not have his corner.
Yes, I can imagine. That. But I guess you can't blame a person in that position. I mean, everybody in that situation is scared, and you can't.
No, absolutely.
However, I think there are some people who actually support the decision of Mr. Clark. They feel that had he not gone through with the suspensions of the students, Southern University may not exist currently.
And that's the thing. And this Mr. Clark had this all on his shoulders.
Right. He kind of.
I mean, he could have his own career in life messed up,
right?
Which was easy to do back then, and he could end up hurting the whole school and thus the future of many more young black kids. And that's a heck of a thing to have to deal with.
Yeah. It was a lot of political pressure.
Yeah. Okay, so these protests, the research and legal learning behind them, all the strategizing, how does that apply today?
Go ahead.
Well, what the Garner case teaches us is that we need to know the law. It tells us to be educated in the law prior to pursuing any form of movement. That's essentially what helped them defeat the charges before the United States Supreme Court. So learning the law, organizing with the community, pooling together your resources, these are all takeaways that today's generation can use and that we are seeing when they want to protest or demonstrate.
For a current example, like with the Alton Sterling shooting, how there were protesters standing along Airline Highway just simply holding up signs, and they were arrested, put in jail for days. They were able to get settlements from the government, and their charges were taken off of their record because of instances like the Garner case, where the court has recognized that if you are in compliance with the law and you're protesting in compliance with the law, the government can't charge you with a criminal conviction. So we're seeing that today, and that is why, as Saba reiterated, the law is so important. And it's really important as an activist to understand the laws.
And know what you're up against.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, and know what to expect that would be outside the law, too, I would think, too.
Yes.
Right.
Because anything is possible, yes.
Right.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, because the head of the Union of Police, I think, in Baton Rouge, when it was decided that these protesters would be financially compensated and to have their records expunged at the state's expense, the head of the police union was upset and said this was a terrible thing, blah, blah, blah. You know, we can't have this. It sets a bad precedent. And I got a kick out of it. It was McKesson, the activist for Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
Ray McKesson. He says it's an example of how you guys got to get control of your police. You know, that's what it is. It's not about us. It's about controlling your men.
Absolutely.
But I find that comment funny about precedent because Garner already set the precedent. He set the precedent for how protesters can't be criminally charged for adhering to. So it's kind of funny that, you know.
Well, not to me. I'm sure the head of the police union wasn't aware of John Garner at all. You know, what he was upset about was actually giving money to these scoundrels that, were out there protesting the murder of Alton Sterling.
Right.
So, but yeah, that really amazed me when I just read that story this morning. I did not follow that much of the story after Alton Sterling was killed. That was basically what I paid attention to in the protest. I thought, in my opinion, they should be able to do what they want to, but. I was really surprised to see that they went by the law. And do you know there was? I guess were either of you involved in those protests?
Which protest?
The Alton Sterling.
I was actually in London, but I did participate in the protests that were going on in London.
Okay, that doesn't count here, though.
No, not here.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I didn't see the crowds. I didn't see how many people were standing out on Airline Highway by the police headquarters.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, it just seems to me that if it's a whole crowd of people, many of them aren't going to be trained in the requirements. So how do so...
Well, what I found was, it was a good amount of people, but a majority of them were just standing there holding signs. Now, a few of them were acting violently and, they didn't receive the settlements or the charges expunged from their record.
That's important to know.
But
okay.
Those who were complying with the law and just, standing there peacefully holding their signs or chanting a protest, that's the individuals who received the settlement and the expungement.
Okay, that's an important distinction because, again, all I saw in the article was how the people who had obeyed the law, and I was wondering, with a crowd that large, like I said, it's tough to control them because they haven't had the training. But that's good to know. Okay, so the people that did step out of line, they were okay. That's good. Yes, I recall during the civil rights protests of the '60s. I don't recall this personally, but I recall reading about them. There was a huge organization under Dr. King and other leaders where they carefully trained the protesters to not resist, to not do anything to justify what the police were doing. And we know the consequences that they suffered.
Right.
But again, that showed the importance, and it showed the importance of organizing. And if there's any advice you would give to modern day activists, and this thought just occurred to me, have you thought about ways today where you could give similar protests to expose these ridiculous customs? I don't want to put you on the spot. But.
Well, yeah, we see them today. So in the 1960s, the issue was equality, right? So what they did, people like Garner and the rest, they did the lunch counter sit-ins. Here today, we see something like Colin Kaepernick, right, who is peacefully protesting the national anthem. And we kind of see that persecution that I was talking about earlier in terms of him not being able to play in the NFL, certain endorsement deals that may have fallen through because of it, and even up to the President of the United States calling him out just by him kneeling during the national anthem. You also see it with the Parkland shooting in Florida, right? How that kind of assembly of the youth came together and they had that march that was successful in D.C. So all of those were legal. All of those were something that was within their rights, within their First Amendment rights. And so it's to say that you still see that present today in terms of combating that First Amendment right to have that freedom of speech and not be persecuted for it.
Right. Okay. Is there any other thing you'd like to offer about John Garner's case, or for the benefit of people who would become activists? Are there any organizations they could contact to get the training they need, or anything like that?
I think if they were to study the Garner case, and also Southern Archives, they have a digital archives that they can access, and they can actually look up all of the documents that we were able to look up and see how students were able to strategize and organize themselves. I think that would be a great takeaway for them as well. And then we also want to mention our restorative justice that we're seeking for Mr. Garner. We want to get his case to be discussed on a broader level. The Garner case is actually 3 consolidated cases. Let me correct that. The Garner case is currently not being taught in any curriculum in Louisiana, which is kind of hard to believe because in hindsight, this was such a success story for the civil rights movement and the people in Louisiana. So it's kind of baffling that it's not being taught in the curriculum. So Southern University has already bestowed onto the 16 students that participated in this movement with honorary degrees, and they've been commemorated by the university. However, we would like to see that same approach being taken by the state So me and Catherine are seeking to get some legislative sponsorship on a resolution that would acknowledge his contributions to the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
I'm glad to have spoken with you. You've been listening to Wayne Parker with a pause for thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. I've been speaking with Catherine Reed and Saba Nagatu, who have shared their research with us regarding civil rights activist John Garner here in Baton Rouge back in the 60s. And ladies, I thank you for your coming in.
Thank you for having us.